Uh, It's like when I do the Winter for Adults class, sometimes I feel like I should just let them keep talking because they're like having reunions.
Hi, Bob. Jimmy, how are you? Good.
You're doing great, man.
Morning, everybody. I hate to bring the good conversation to a close. We're going to start a few minutes early today just so that we can make sure that Art has enough time to get up to the actual current situation. His former colleague, Jimmy, was taking odds on bets whether or not he'd managed to get to the current moment. So I've got that bet covered, Jimmy. I think he is. So, Art, it has been such a delight to have you with us these weeks. I can't think as we enter into Holy Week a more important topic than what we're wrestling with now. What does it mean that we call this place the Holy Land? And what does it mean to see the kind of suffering we see now? So we hope that your presentation will help us gain further insight into this incredible, challenging topic where we see um, Abraham's children in conflict with one another. Um, Thank you again, and look forward to having Fran close us out. And I want to thank her for her good offices in helping us get Art here for this important time. Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody, and welcome to those of you on Zoom.
Okay. They only have 75 years to try to compress. And of course, I've covered hundreds of years before this, but no, it is a standing joke. I told y'all before at Harpeth Hall that when someone asks me a question about a contemporary event, that I immediately say, well, we need to go back to, 5 centuries or but with the Middle East, you really do have to do that. But I am going to try to at least jump a little bit to the present, believe it or not. But this is 1948, I guess, or 47. Harry Truman there with Chaim Weizmann, who we talked about before, who was the head of the World Zionist Organization, particularly after Theodore Herzl died at the age of 44. And Weizmann, who spent most of his life outside of Israel, usually in Britain, but he was instrumental in getting the United States to support the partition is what they want us to support, basically. And I'm going to go on to the next thing. This I wanted to start off with, though. These are the countries that have recognized Israel's right to exist, the green ones. And then you can see most of the Arab world has not. And certainly the populations of some of these countries aren't necessarily really happy about the recognition. I think if you had a poll in Egypt today, probably the majority of Egyptians would say they wish that they could break relations with Israel. But it shows you why there's still this ongoing problem. Israel celebrated its 75th uh, birthday last year, but it's been a controversial country ever since it was created. And I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. There was an article in The Economist just a month before the October 7th attack happened last year, and it was sort of guardedly optimistic about how things seem to be getting better in the Middle East, particularly at sort of the Abraham Accords, because so I mean, can y'all all see the dates on there? Yeah, you can see them. That several of them are the year 2020. That during the Trump administration, they pulled off this deal, as they were very proud of, in which some of the more moderate countries, to be honest, obviously the hardline countries did not sign on to this, but the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco, which has always been a fairly pro-Western Arab country, still has a monarchy, agreed, and Jordan did it back in 1994, sort of in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. And the key country, of course, was Saudi Arabia, which did not formally do that, but they seem to be getting fairly close, which is kind of astonishing to a lot of people who know the history of that part of the world. But a lot of what this has happened, since we're trying to talk about current events, is the fear of Iranian power and influence has really created these sort of, politics make strange bedfellows. And Saudi Arabia, very much a conservative Sunni monarchy, Iran, a radical Islamic republic that's Shia. So Saudi Arabia perhaps was getting ready to sign on to the Abraham Accords, they call them. But then, and that's possibly the main reason why Hamas did what it did back in October. I mean, I'm not a geopolitical expert really, but no one really knows exactly what was going through their minds. But it seems to me fairly obvious that what Hamas was trying to do was to terminate these agreements, or at least, stop them in their tracks, because they knew that Saudi Arabia just would not be able to sign any kind of recognition of Israel if something like the Gaza war was going on. And so, if for no other reason, there are other reasons, I think. Someone in one class I was teaching about some of this said that he had heard that the date was picked October 7th because it's Vladimir Putin's birthday, and that somehow Russia was kind of behind all this. And I said, well, that is his birthday. 1952 is when he was born. But there's a much more significant day that was actually one day before that, but 50 years almost to the day, October 6, 1973. What happened that day, which is certainly what they were commemorating. I don't think it was Vladimir's birthday, but October 6, 1973. What Jewish holiday occurs usually in early October? Yeah, so the Yom Kippur War started then. And so that's extremely significant because it's the last time that the actually Arab nation states attempted to end Israel essentially and failed. But that's, I think, the main reason. One thing too, before I forget, a little off the subject, but I think it was the first Sunday, maybe the second Sunday, someone asked me about the matrilineal descent of Jews. I don't know, it was a woman. I don't know if she's still here. Okay, I can't remember what I was talking about that made that come up. What you were asking, is that why you're considered Jewish through your mother's line? Oh, okay, yes, okay. So I looked it up, and apparently no. I thought it was probably much older, and it is, but there's no certainty. They said now scholars think that tradition either started in like the 1st or 2nd century of the Christian era, or possibly under Ezra, which would be the 5th century BCE. So we're talking about like a 600-year span, but it has gone on for a very long time. That what they say is if your father is Jewish but your mother's not, then you have to go through an actual conversion process to be considered Jewish. But if your mother is considered Jewish, then you are automatically Jewish. But anyway, so I want to answer that question. But the reason why Israel, of course, is so contentious is that the Arab world almost uniformly feels like it shouldn't have been created. There are obviously Arab countries that have now been willing to, at least their governments have been willing to accept a certain reality, although it took a while. Like I said, Egypt was the first, and that wasn't until 30 years after the first Arab-Israeli war. But going back to one of the many plans that were put forward during the 30s when the British still had a mandate there, the one that I think a lot of Palestinians would love to have now was the Peel Commission had this partition plan in 1937, in which you would have an Arab Palestinian state, obviously largely in the south, a Jewish state in the north, and then the enclave. A lot of people are saying, in fact, the papacy still says that what Jerusalem should be is like an international open city governed through the UN. That's still the position of the Roman Catholic Church. The UN resolution in 1967 did not specifically say that, but after the 6-Day War, they did say that Israel needed to withdraw back to its pre-1967 borders. But the issue of Jerusalem itself, of course, is so contentious in and of itself. And it's ironic that eventually people say that the name Jerusalem comes from the city of peace. Apparently that's not the actual origin of it, but people now interpret that way. And obviously there's been nothing peaceful about it. As I said, particularly the Old Quarter, someone described as the 35 most combustible acres on earth. Theodor Herzl, the father of the Zionist movement in some ways, he didn't like Jerusalem, which again shows you he was not a traditional Jew at all. He said it was just, to him, it was just surrounded by fanaticisms on all sides. He thought both the Jews and the Arabs in Jerusalem were just fanatical. He wanted the capital actually to be Haifa, which is over there on the coast, northern coast, which is on there actually. As you see here, the plan was also to have Nazareth as a mandated enclave. But the Arab world and the Palestinians leaders and all, they utterly rejected it. And obviously Israelis and Zionist supporters always argue that, there were all these plans where there was going to be a Palestine, but they kept rejecting it. This is the partition plan, though, that the UN came up with in 1947 when Britain was just fed up with this whole question because they were being attacked both by Arabs and by Jews. There were Jewish extremist groups who certainly the British government called terrorist groups, like the Irgun and the Lehi. I think I talked a little bit about them. Who were very, very effective at waging a campaign of terror. And they used the word terror. I don't think, maybe don't have that picture. Yeah, well, I know you're thinking terrorism, there's terror right there. Yes. I guess I have it in my other slide. I'm going to try to flip over to it now. But some of you know that the eventually leader of the Irgun, which was certainly a very effective group, was Menachem Begin, who later became, of course, the prime minister in 1977. And then Yitzhak Shamir. Yitzhak Shamir was the leader of the even more extreme group that the British called the Stern Gang, but it was called the Lehi. And there's a poster that has both of them on a wanted poster from the British government from the late 1930s. And sometimes when the Israeli government would say, like in the 1980s, we're not going to negotiate with the PLO because they're terrorists, we don't negotiate with terrorism. There was one meeting where the Palestinians just lifted up a copy of that photo that had Shamir, who was the current prime minister, and, Begin on there as terrorists. And of course, there is this, there's a saying, the Irish came up with this saying, supposedly, that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And, I kind of hate to say that because I don't like that kind of easy, cheap sort of moral relativism, like everyone's doing the same horrible things. But there's obviously a great deal of truth to that. Jomo Kenyatta was called a terrorist by the British government for years and years, but finally they let him out of prison. He became the first leader in 1963 of Kenya and independent Kenya. And very quickly, the white settlers that were still there in the British government thought he was just a wonderful person. So he went from being a terrorist to a, African statesman, so on. But anyway, this plan did not happen either because the Arab world, again, rejected it. It did give slightly more territory to a Jewish state. It was like 56%, even though Jews were probably only a third of the population there, maybe a little bit more than that by 1947, but they were still the minority. But sometimes Israelis point out that particularly down here, Negev Desert, a lot of that was, not almost livable. So that really the Arabs got the better land to some extent. But the Palestinian Council rejected it. The Arab neighboring countries all around it rejected it. But it was passed in May, and I think now if you have your list, yeah, UN voted for partition in November of 1947. And it was not extremely close, but the United States definitely pushed for this to happen. And there are all kinds of things. A lot of the British people accuse Truman of basically playing politics, that Truman was just trying to get Jewish votes, particularly in New York. And there's a lot of evidence that was part of his calculation. I think he also sincerely felt sorry for Jews. I think, in some ways he was a fairly simple man about geopolitical things. At least the British thought he was. But in any case, we twisted some arms, convinced some people. But by the way, the Soviet Union voted for the creation of Israel too, because at least briefly they thought that state might be kind of pro-Soviet. They thought some of the more conservative Arab monarchies were too pro-British. Plus, we talked all about how, the founders of Israel largely were socialists, if not actual communists, and the whole kibbutz ideal and so like that. In fact, how many of you know that Bernie Sanders spent a few months in 1963 on a kibbutz? Anyone knew that? Yeah, he did. He tends to be very vague about it. I don't know if he was worried about it. I mean, it was actually an Israeli newspaper that finally had to delve into this. But in, I think, 1963, when he would have been around early 20s, I think, he was at this kibbutz that was very much a left-wing, pretty radical kibbutz. In fact, earlier, about 10 years, I guess, before he was there, when Stalin died in 1953, that kibbutz actually commemorated his death, in positive terms. Now, I think if some Republicans dug that up later and found out that fact, but in any case, obviously, Bernie would say, I'm not a Stalinist, but anyway, it is an interesting part about his youthful days. But instead, what happens is this man, of course, was a leader of the Jewish agency there, the man who became the first prime minister of Israel. I talked about him before. Showed you this picture why he has a lion's tail. But David Ben-Gurion, the Zionists, the Israelis definitely accepted that partition. They were, even though some of them, the more hardline, said, well, we want all of the Palestine mandate. We also want, the so-called West Bank. But this is what ends up happening with this French map here, is the neighboring countries invaded, Transjordan, as it was called then, Syria, even Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq, that doesn't even border this area, but Iraq, they all declared war on this Jewish state. So the Declaration of Independence, May 14th, it's obviously celebrated by Israelis, by not every Jewish person in the world, but to Palestinians, it very quickly became known as the Nakba, which you'll see spelled different ways, which means the catastrophe, because it was for them. And the fighting starts even before May of 1948. There were massacres on both sides and all sorts of things. And the British just completely withdrew into their bases. By November of 1947, they said, we're just done with this. Very, I would say, extremely irresponsible. But what you had were the Arab nations taking parts of what was supposed to be, as you can see on this map, a part of a Palestinian state. The part in Gaza, for example, that was supposed to be part of a Palestine was taken by Egypt, which they had until 1967. And more importantly, the West Bank was taken by what was then called the Kingdom of Transjordan, this Hashemite, fairly conservative kingdom, and they incorporated it into their country. And so that's when they changed their name to just Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, because it was no longer just on the other side of the Jordan River. And they took East Jerusalem, which is the part that has all the religious significance. But as you can see, what happened was Israel went from being maybe 56% of the original mandate to being about 77% of it. And the great majority of Arab Palestinians living in the areas that became the light and dark purple there, that became Israel, about 80% of them fled. Some of them never did. Some of them are there today that are called the Arab Israelis, and they have a right to vote. They have, in most ways, equal civil liberties, at least the Israeli government claims. The one difference is they don't have to serve into the military the way any Jewish Israeli does. Now, you might say, well, that's a privilege, but in some ways not, because, in a country, serving in your country's army is a sign of being a full citizen. It should be considered an honor. And, there are some, particularly Arabs, not so much Muslim Arabs, but some of the Druze who speak Arabic, but they're from this religion that used to be part of a Shia Islam sect, but then became a separate. They actually serve in the Israeli army. But most of the Muslim Arab Palestinians, and the Christians for that matter, are very ambivalent, of course, in some ways about serving in the Israeli government. But let's see what we have next here. But this is what you kind of ended up with. And there was no peace treaty. The war went on, the first of several Arab-Israeli wars, ends in 1949 with some ceasefires, but obviously some of these countries, like Syria, has never signed anything recognizing Israel's right to exist. But David Ben-Gurion became the prime minister. The Labor Party, which is sort of a moderate left-wing party in Israel, they ran Israel for about almost 30 years without a break. Most of that time, he was the prime minister. He was prime minister from 48 until 63. There was one brief interruption when he wasn't. But and the big airport today outside Tel Aviv is David Ben-Gurion. But it's a famous photo of him. On a lighter note, I think I told you that he was not a practicing Jew. Like I said, none of the prime ministers of Israel have been, except for Naftali Bennett for about a year. He was very interested in Hinduism and Buddhism. And of course, here he's doing yoga on this beach. And the Israelis, of course, think this is hilarious. And so there was an Israeli sculptor who made these things. So you can go today, there's a close-up of it. This guy just kind of casually walking past it, but there's David Ben-Gurion. But it tells you something about the Israelis and maybe why Americans tend to just almost instinctively sympathize with them more than Arabs. Arabs have a sense of humor, obviously. We just maybe don't get it as much. But the idea of a Jewish kind of sardonic sense of humor and a kind of irreverence, I don't think we would have a sculpture of George Washington standing on his head wearing, a Speedo or something. But to Israel, it's like, we're Jews. But this is the Suez Canal and then the Red Sea. So you have in Israel in 49, no one in the Arab world recognized them at that point. But for the next several years, we had controversies, particularly because Egypt at this point, unlike now, was one of the more radical Arab states, mainly because who was running Egypt from 1952 until he died in 1950? Yeah, and I have a picture of him. There he is. Had wonderful teeth. He was an army officer that led this group of officers who in 1952 overthrew the Egyptian monarchy, which had been set up by Britain. Technically, Egypt became independent in 1922, but the British still had military bases there. The Anglo-French Suez Company still owned the Suez Canal, which was by far the most important resource. We'll go back to it. This is an American aircraft carrier going through it. So most Egyptians would say we were not really independent until the monarchy was overthrown and King Farouk was driven into exile. But it's a canal that's, I can show you this picture again, it's about 100 miles long. It doesn't have locks like the Panama Canal because it's not, in a mountainous area, it's flat. And it's really more important in most ways than even the Panama. the last statistic I found, which was probably from like the 1990s, but that roughly 11,000 ships a year go through the Panama Canal, but 18,000 go through the Suez. It's of course where the oil that goes to Europe from the Gulf goes through there. Obviously, European shipments back and forth between East Asia and South Asia to Europe. It's the most important waterway in the world, I would argue. It's also wide enough. A lot of you know the Panama Canal now is really almost obsolete. The big oil tankers can't get through it. The American aircraft carriers can't get through it. So there's all this talk about either widening it or maybe building a whole new Panama Canal, possibly in Nicaragua. Anyways, a different lecture. But what what happened? There's another picture of NASA. Is in 1956, the British finally pulled their troops out of the canal zone because Nasser was really putting pressure on them. But he promised that he would not nationalize the canal without peacefully negotiating with the French and the British. And so the British kind of grudgingly leave. And then that summer, he did grab it and nationalize it. And he became a huge hero all over, not just the Arab world, but all over the whole sort of third world, you might say. They were Black African families that had pictures of Nasser in their homes because he was standing up to imperialism in a very, dramatic way. He was a great speaker. He could use the Arabic language as a great rhetorician. I think his accomplishments for Egypt, I think, are very mixed, speaking as an outsider. But all of you know, I think, about the Suez Crisis, and it led to a brief war because neither Britain or France took this really well. And it was not just that Nasser now had nationalized and grabbed this vital, Suez Canal. Sir Anthony Eden was the Prime Minister of Britain. He had already decided that Nasser needed to go because Nasser was stirring up Arabs all over the Arab world in these more conservative monarchies that Britain was supporting, like Jordan and Iraq. The French resented the fact that Egypt was stirring up the Algerians because France was fighting this very nasty war, colonial war in Algeria from 1954 to 62 and so on. So there's a lot of different reasons. So secretly, in the fall of 1956, the British and the French colluded with Israel because Israel, of course, had problems with Egypt because there were guerrillas who had been striking across from the Sinai into Israel, making these terrorist attacks already, very small scale compared to what happens later. So the French and British knew that. So the plan was that Israel would invade the Sinai, head towards the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, France and Britain would say that we're going to intervene to preserve the canal and make peace, but we'll demand that Egypt pull this army like 50 miles away from the Suez Canal. But it was all, just fraudulently, it was all just a front. And I think everyone in the world saw through that. But the Israeli army did extremely well. In fact, so fast that they flew across the Sinai, got firstly to the Suez Canal before the British and French could even get there to maintain peace. But France and Britain did land there, paratroopers and others. I've got some pictures from this. This is actually a Russian cartoon mocking all this. It was called Operation Musketeer, if you're wondering why he's dressed in the 17th century get up. But then it has obviously a modern British soldier. He's a Scottish Highlander. He's wearing his kilt. But Russia very quickly now took the side of the Arabs. They had made the calculation that Israel was not the best friend to have because they don't have any oil, but the Arab world does. Plus, there's a whole lot more of them. It's like, if y'all remember Billy Carter, yeah, my students, of course, would not, but you remember he's kind of a standing joke and all. But at one point, he decided to make himself like ambassador to the Arab world. Y'all remember this? After his beer wasn't selling too well, the Billy beer. But, and people were saying, look, you're undermining your brother who's trying to be very delicate negotiations. And then Billy's kind of intervened in this kind of bumptious way. But the way he put it was, we need to get friendlier with the Arabs because he said, there's a whole lot more Arabs in the world than there are Jews. And he's right from as far as that goes. But here's French paratroopers being their hands shaken with a British officer. These are British soldiers celebrating because militarily, it was a complete success. They took the Suez Canal back without a whole lot of problems, but it was geopolitically a disaster because the world generally condemned all this, including the United States. Khrushchev kept saying, I'm going to fire rockets to the British if they don't leave, which he had no intention of doing. But almost every country in the world voted to condemn Britain. Do you want to take a guess? A few abstained, but most voted to condemn this whole thing, what the French and British had done. You want to take a guess at the only two countries that voted in favor of Britain in the UN in November? Australia and New Zealand. No, Canada didn't, but only the Anzacs, yeah. Because back then, apparently, New Zealand was almost more British than the British, which has changed, apparently, in the last few decades. This is a Soviet cartoon because the French and British kind of sheepishly had to pull out. The United States there was pressure on the pound, and we refused to try to support it through the IMF. All these things were happening because we were furious. One, because we thought that's just going to drive the Arab world into the hands of the Soviets. It wasn't so much we really felt sorry for Egypt or anything like that, but also they didn't consult with us, which infuriated the Eisenhower administration. And in fact, the Suez, like you know, is a huge turning point, particularly the British. I think Americans don't realize how much that crisis changed their world, because one, they have never tried any major, strategic operation without America at least being informed of it. They have not been able to operate as a superpower anymore, or as a great power. And but one historian put it this way: said that the Suez Crisis did not presage Britain's end as being a great power. It merely shows something that had already become true, which I think is true. But very quickly after '56, Britain began to withdraw its troops, particularly east of Suez, as they put it. The winds of change blowing through Africa definitely started blowing much more. If you think about it, at least sub-Saharan Black Africa, Britain still had all its colonies there in 1956, but in '57 they let go of Ghana, and then when 3 years Nigeria, in the early '60s, all the rest of it. And it's not just because of Suez, but it certainly, I think, sped up that process. But there's a lot of other things that come from this. But it certainly did not improve relations between Israel and the Arab world. It didn't improve relations for a while between us and the French and British, but they kind of got over it, I think. But that, and Nasser just became even more popular because even though militarily he was defeated, they got the canal back and everything else. The next thing, since I'm trying to fly through, there's a lot of stuff I could talk about, obviously, but that so that's the second Arab-Israeli war, 1956, as part of this whole Suez crisis. '67, which I remember vividly. I guess I was between my 7th and 8th grade year. In early June of 1967, the so-called 6-Day War. How many of y'all do remember that when it happened? Okay, because I also remember how I think the vast majority of Americans, certainly I had no question in my mind who the good guys were. The good guys were the Israelis. They were the underdogs. They were on our side as opposed to the Egyptians and everybody on the Soviet side. It was just, and the Israeli army, of course, did just this amazing job. This is when they start becoming known as almost like these supermen militarily. Because Egypt and Syria and Jordan all kind of agreed to work together in case of emergency, and they were threatening Israel in various ways. Some of it might have been a bluff. The Soviets were probably pushing them to do it. And all of you know that often for an Arab government, the one thing they can do to get their people on their side is to beat the drum about how horrible Israel is. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't mean there's no justice in that case, but certainly when your own people are dissatisfied and trying to bring the Arab world together, pan-Arabism has never had much of real effect. But the one thing most Arab countries could agree on is that the Palestinians have been treated horribly and something needs to be done, But in this case, Israel struck first, and in literally 6 days, they took, as you can see, the whole Sinai Peninsula, drove all the way to Suez Canal, took the entire West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which meant so much to them and still does. And also, y'all probably remember, took the so-called the Golan Heights there from Syria. Now, they still have the Golan. In fact, they annexed it in the early 1980s, so it's technically Israel, they would say. The West Bank and Gaza, of course, are still occupied territories. The Sinai, it was given back. It was part of the Camp David Accords, as we'll see. But one of the ironies of this war is the way the Israelis were so successful was they basically used the tactics that used to be called blitzkrieg, which means, lightning war in German, that in the early part of World War II, the Germans did this with rapidly moving mechanized forces, close air support, and the Israelis, if anything, did it better than the Germans did. They could have gone all the way to the capitals. They could have taken Damascus in Syria and Amman, probably in Jordan, and Cairo. But they didn't, because it's like, what do? You can try to take over the whole Arab world, of these numbers. But this is when Israelis made all these jokes about, reserving rooms in the Cairo Hilton for a bar mitzvah and things like this, and of course, in some ways, I remember, I still have this Life magazine. Actually, I showed it to my students. The Israeli onslaught, and then this famous picture in the Suez Canal cooling down. He's got an AK-47 in his hand, so I assume that's a captured machine gun from the Egyptians. But it was just astonishing. But I think, there's sometimes a rapid victory like that leads to worse things because you become overconfident, for one. And there's certainly an element of hubris, which a lot of Israelis will now say about this because it was such a striking victory. But also, I always want to tell my students about how there's nothing intrinsic about any culture that makes them either great warriors or not. At certain times in history, some cultures have been viewed as not being very good soldiers, but other times they have. And for example, there was a German who actually pointed out after this, he said, isn't it interesting? He said, now that the Jews are the warriors now, and we're the merchants, the Germans, because Germany right now does not have a great military, despite their history. And the Israelis certainly do. Particularly, a lot of people say their Air Force is the man for man, the best Air Force in the world, probably. Um, but what a lot of the world hoped, and certainly the United States hoped, and some Israelis hoped, is we now can trade land for peace, was the formula. And that's what the UN said you should do. And the UN passed a resolution 242, security resolution, which is still on the books, but it was passed in late 1967, that said what should happen is that Israel should pull back to its pre-67 borders, but that the Arab world should all agree to recognize Israel's right to exist and make peace. But that obviously hasn't happened because I think from both sides. On the Arab side, the Arab League had a meeting in Khartoum, in Sudan in late 67, and they had the so-called three no's: no negotiations, no recognition of Israel, no peace treaty. And as one Israeli said, this is the first time in history where the losers have actually dictated the peace terms. But they could, in a sense, because what's Israel going to do? But also, increasingly, Israelis, for all kinds of reasons, said, we kind of like having this territory. One, more secure borders, certainly having the Suez Canal as your border and then the Red Sea, as opposed to this land border, which sometimes, Israelis have called them. We have Auschwitz borders, and they really do have a kind of a frontier mentality. They also nowadays tend to say we are a one-bomb state. I have a friend who's lived in Israel, meaning it would just take really one really powerful thermonuclear weapon to destroy our country. That's why we have to be so aware of our security and so paranoid and so on, and that's their perspective, but a one-bomb state. If you're wondering the size of pre-67 Israel, the one that, they had before this war, it's about a fifth the size of Tennessee in square miles. It's not even as big as like Middle Tennessee. So, but the other reason, and this is the thing I think increasingly, this is a whole new set of lectures about this one, how much more religious the struggle starts to become. I think I said this last time, on both sides. Israel was certainly founded by people who were not observant Jews. Like I said, David Ben-Gurion, he liked Buddhism and Hinduism. He worked on Yom Kippur. He did not follow the dietary laws. He was not an observant Jew in any real way, but he was very much a Jew. But now you do have increasingly, because their birth rates are so much higher, for one, demographics, that the ultra-Orthodox Jews, who at first, when all this Zionism thing started, they were almost uniformly against it. They thought this was a heresy, blasphemy, to try to create an Israel, Israel, a land of Israel, without the Messiah actually showing up to do it. But I think I don't think I know that this victory in part changed the minds of a whole lot of the Orthodox, particularly the so-called ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, to say, no, this actually is providential. God works in mysterious ways. And even though they knew that Israel was founded mainly by these secular sort of socialist Jews, that, it's still God's plan, and that we should now support this creation, but we should also expand Israel. We certainly should hold on to the West Bank, because to a lot of Jews, that's where the really sacred parts, certainly hold on to East Jerusalem, without question. But even the West Bank, which has places like Hebron, which is where the cave of the patriarchs, the tomb of the patriarchs is, they call that area, of course, a lot of Jews call it, Judea and Samaria. They don't call it the West Bank. And they are adamant that we should not let go of this stuff. And maybe even the Gaza Strip, because, the Kingdom of Israel had the Gaza Strip in it, So, so for all a combination of reasons, the fact that Arabs didn't seem to want to negotiate, the fact that more and more Jews said, well, we kind of, or at least Israelis said, we're kind of happy with this situation. So in certain respects, it has lasted. This is the map again. Today, as you can see, Golan annexed, West Bank and Gaza Strip supposed to be full or partial Palestinian control. This is Nasser after this defeat. He lasted another 3 years. He died in 1970, and most Egyptians still really mourned his death. But some of you, how many of you have seen this photo? It's one of the great photos from Life magazine. These are Israeli soldiers entering East Jerusalem. They're standing obviously next to the Western Wall. Some people call it the Wailing Wall, although I think you're not supposed to actually call it that. And they really are just kind of amazed at what they've just done. Here's a sort of a close-up of them. It's a brilliant example of photojournalism. And very few Israelis want to give East Jerusalem back. But the plan that came closest maybe to solving all this, that in 1999 and Clinton last year, Bill Clinton and all, was to, create a Palestine that would include part of East Jerusalem would be what Palestinians want to be their capital, but that still most of particularly, modern Jerusalem would still be Israeli and so on. But that plan, Yasser Arafat, rejected it. And most Israelis say, okay, we offered the best deal we could have offered. I know a lot of Palestinians would say, no, it was still very much like a moth-eaten kind of Palestine. And, you can go back and forth on that question. But I knew that Yasser Arafat later saw Clinton and, told Clinton, you've done a wonderful job as a president. And Clinton said, no, I haven't. And you're the reason why I haven't, that you scotched this deal. But this is an Israeli soldier changing the Arabic name there on the Wailing Wall. And of course, this whole area, the Temple Mount, has become so contentious. It's just become more and more of an issue since then. And the Temple Mount has what's called the Noble Sanctuary on it. It's on, I think, the first page of your list, probably if you still have one. Because it includes not just the Dome of the Rock, which is supposed to be the spot where Muhammad ascended into heaven, but it also has a mosque right across from it, called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The furthest mosque is what it means. So that whole area, which is the third most sacred place on earth to Muslims, but obviously observant Jews say, oh yeah, well, it is our most sacred spot. And you took over back in the 600s and built this dome and everything is mosque to basically show that you were now dominating us. And they just see it as a standing insult, which it kind of was. But this is the kind of thing, obviously, religions don't tend to be able to compromise very well. Now, the Israeli government has generally had the policy of not allowing Jews to get up on top of the Temple Mount, and worship. They worship down there at the base of it where the Western Wall is, the Wailing Wall. But all this, of course, is claustrophobically close to one another. But one person that begins to emerge on all this, since the Arab nations seem to be failing in terms of getting rid of Israel, is the PLO. Yasser Arafat was the leader of a group that was specifically called Fatah, which means victory, but it's an acronym of the Palestinian resistance movement. But it became the core of what became the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, in 1964. And by 69, you started hearing about them making these attacks across the border into Israel and so on. There's Yasser wearing his keffiyeh. He died, in 2004. He's a controversial figure. I really think historians will end up saying that he was, in some ways, a disaster for the Palestinians, really. But this is the emblem originally of the PLO. Like I said, it's a coalition of states. And it was originally, very much a secular nationalist Arab organization. It was not an Islamist organization. Most of the people in it obviously were Muslims, but some of the main leaders were Arab Christians. George Habash, who was a leader of a more radical faction, the one who kind of pioneered the skyjacking, he was a Palestinian Christian. Muslims aren't usually called George. But this is the new and improved PLO symbol. I'm not sure what year they updated it, but again, you can see it there. There's nothing particularly religious about it. There's grenades and machine guns, and of course the map of all of the mandate, again, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, sort of thing. And even though eventually with Oslo Accords, the PLO at least has recognized the right of Israel to exist, but it is kind of interesting that the flag, the map they have on here, there's no Israel. That's the whole Palestine mandate there in the keffiyeh. It's also interesting they now have this more overtly religious symbol. The Dome of the Rock is on there. Hamas has always had that as their main symbol, because they've always said our real opposition is not based on Arab nationalism. It's based on the fact that infidels, Zionists, should not hold what they call Al-Quds, which means the holy city, the holy place. But even the PLO, because they realize how more and more this religious appeal is strengthening things. I don't think I have to explain the dove with the chains breaking the Palestinian flag, but you might not know that is a key, like to a door, because some of you might know this. A lot of Palestinian families who are living in refugee camps or living in exile still have the keys to their homes from 1948 when they fled. Hold on, we'll talk about that. And I've been telling this story mainly from the Jewish perspective for more than one reason. But there is this side that I think most, well, at least older Americans tend to instinctively support Israel. I think I can say that safely. Younger Americans, it's very, very different. It's an amazing kind of generational gap there. And there's all kinds of ways to try to explain that. But I think one thing that brought it home to me about seeing it from the Palestinian side is, that a lot of Soviet Union's Jewish population was able to leave finally when you started having more détente, and then finally Gorbachev. And they make up a pretty big percentage now of Israel's population, but they're obviously very recent arrivals. And Palestinians talk about it just infuriates them that often that the Israeli soldiers are these, former Soviet Union Jews who bully them, intimidate them, and demand to see their papers, demand, all these checkpoints going through in a country that they obviously say, my family's been here for over 1,000 years, and these interlopers are making me feel like a stranger in my own, I mean, who wouldn't resist that? Who would not hate them, So it's a tough question, obviously. It's about the toughest I can think of. Do you know who this is? Y'all recognize him? He was, King Hussein, who ruled Jordan for almost forever. He was generally fairly pro-Western, moderate, and so on. He did join in that war in 1967, but he eventually was kind of an enemy of the PLO because, need to mention this point, at one point, I guess as R.L. Sharon said, when people talk about there needs to be a Palestine, he said there already is a Palestine. He said it's called Jordan. And it is true that that Jordan part of the original Palestinian mandate that Britain had, some people thought would be like the Arab Palestine, and then the Jews would have the part west of the Jordan River. Do you see? I mean, that's just, but the PLO had their headquarters in Jordan for a while, but in 1970, they had these skyjackings. And again, how many of y'all remember this? Because this is why the start of us having to have metal detectors and everything else, it's just gotten worse and worse. My students cannot believe that up until 1970, you could just walk on board a plane, that you actually did, just kind of walked across the tarmac and then went up the steps to it. And they were like, are you kidding? Because now you have to like undress, and everything. And if you're don't have a ticket, you can't be anywhere close. Anyway, said, yeah, it's a different world. But several jets were hijacked. One was a Swiss Air one. There was a couple of TWA jets. They tried to hijack an El Al, an Israeli plane, and they were foiled. There's never been an El Al jet that's been hijacked because they are very aware of security. But they flew them and landed them in this old abandoned British airfield in Jordan, and it infuriated the king of Jordan because it was an embarrassment to him. And finally, these people, almost no one was killed. They released the hostages eventually in terms of they had an exchange and so on. But then they blew up some of these jets here. One of the women involved was Layla Khalid, who became an icon. She was a young Palestinian who was in the PLO, part of this more militant group within the PLO, who was part of the takeover of one of the jets. But then when she was imprisoned, another jet was skyjacked to force the British, I think, to let her go. And eventually they did let go of her. She's still alive. She's, I think, 10 years older than I am. But there she is in Belfast, West Belfast, the Catholic part of Belfast, because the Northern Irish Catholics, some you might know, are very, very pro-Palestinian. They, sympathize, they identify with the Palestinian cause, and this is a mural that's got, an IRA martyr there on one side, and then Layla Khalid on the other side. Recently, the Israeli national basketball team, women's team, played the Irish national team. Do y'all know about this? It was like a month ago. And the Irish team refused to shake the hands of the Israeli female players. And then Israel just beat up on them, beat them by like 30 points, but so don't mess with Israel. But the term Black September, what happened was King Hussein went after the PLO and fought a brief war there in September 1970 and drove them out in the headquarters, at least. Most of the Palestinians are still there. But the PLO and the Arafat had to relocate to West Beirut up in Lebanon. You can see there what happened. And the majority of the population of Jordan, it's not a really densely populated country, are actually people who would identify as Palestinian. So when Ariel Sharon said there already is a Palestine, it's called Jordan, I mean, he in some ways was stating a certain fact. But what does Black September mean to y'all in terms of all the stuff we're talking about? Do you remember the 1972 Munich Olympics? That group called itself the Black September Group. They were a radical faction of the PLO. Arafat didn't necessarily sign off on this. We probably knew about it. But who went in, of course, took Israeli athletes as hostages, killed a couple in the process. For several days, it froze the Olympics. This is obviously a famous photo of this guy negotiating with the West German police. Finally, they worked out a deal where they were going to go to the airport and fly out with their hostages and then release them. But it all went bad because the West German police tried to stop it. And it ended up all the hostages were killed. Some of the PLO people were killed. And it just all went horribly wrong. And of course, the question was, do we keep having the Olympics If you remember, they did. They had like one day, kind of Memorial Day, and then it picked up again, which infuriated a lot of Israelis. Their teams, of course, went home. But do most of y'all remember that too? I'm assuming again. The advantage of teaching people who are at least close to my age is you remember these things. Yes. Some of my students know about this, but obviously, but yes, murder in Munich. And again, talking about security, obviously there was almost no security at the Olympic Village until up to 72. Now it's, it's like an armed fortress kind of. This is the movie. I think you told me about that I needed to watch this. I think originally, yes. Steven Spielberg did about the Israeli plan to then basically take revenge on the people who were involved in all this, Operation Gideon, I guess. Golda Meir was the prime minister by then. She was also Labor Party, same as Ben-Gurion. But this is a long quote. It's mainly about not being beautiful was my blessing, so I always show this to my students. It's like, see, it can be a blessing not to be a pretty person, But anyway, there she is on the currency. But moving on, Yom Kippur War, October 1973, the fourth and last Arab-Israeli war in terms of countries fighting Israel. Obviously, the war is still going on. It's never really stopped. But this time, the Arabs struck first. And briefly, they started to win. And it was just Syria and Egypt this time. Jordan decided to sit this one out. The Israelis had gotten arrogant. They thought that Arab countries are just, cannot fight. But the Egyptians managed to cross the Suez, got into Sinai. Syria started going down into the Golan Line. And for a while, Israel was there's a recent movie about Golda Meir that shows how terrified they were that they actually were going to be annihilated. Again, this country is this small. And I had a friend in graduate school who was in the American military in 73 in West Germany. He said, American people never told us, but we stripped a lot of weapons from American military bases and sent them quickly to Israel so Israel would not fall. And if a lot of Americans had known that, they would have been furious because the Soviet Union then could have attacked West Germany, with NATO allies. But I don't think I've told you all this, but National Review, the conservative magazine, years ago when it was still Buckley's magazine, when Buckley's still alive, they actually had an article, editorial arguing that we should just make Israel the 51st state. They were only being half facetious. They basically were saying, we already act that way, that their security seemed to be just as important as our own, which again, some people really do not like that. Some people think that's wonderful. But again, the Israelis sort of caught their breath, and after a couple of days, they managed to recover. They counterattacked with a lot of weapons that we had sent to them. This is, of course, Nixon. And briefly, the Israeli army even crossed the Suez Canal over into Egyptian territory. But then you have this long negotiation where Kissinger particularly kind of made his name, and Nixon to, the Israelis withdrew. It still didn't bring a lasting peace, of course. But the other thing you all remember from 73 was the oil weapon and OPEC. And that's why King Faisal, Saudi Arabia, is on there. He was Person of the Year eventually for 1974 because that huge oil hike, that happened. But finally, the breakthrough. How much time do I have? I have 10 minutes to. Okay. Does that include time for people to ask questions? Okay. Anwar Sadat, another man of the year, won the Nobel Prize. He took over after Nasser died. He was kind of the handpicked successor, I think. He obviously was part of that war, the Yom Kippur War. But by 1976, he was starting to break with the Soviets, trying to get closer to the United States. But above all, he took this amazing sort of chance, which in some ways ends up leading to his death eventually. But he flew to Israel, spoke to Knesset, the Israeli, parliament, said we need to make peace. This has gone on too long. And Menachem Begin was now the prime minister, had just come in. So the first time you had this hardliner, more right-wing government, the Likud. But in some ways that worked better because some of you all know the expression, only Nixon could go to China, because no one could accuse Nixon of being soft on communism, if you knew his whole earlier career. So he could do it, whereas a liberal Democrat would have never been able to do it probably. Menachem Begin probably the same way. I mean, he was the guy that led the Irgun, and he was definitely not as softy about anything. But he was willing to let Sadat come and speak and all. And then, of course, Jimmy Carter, who claims he thought it was the greatest achievement, bringing these guys together at Camp David with that big Georgia smile, and got them kind of away from the media eye and everything. And they worked out the so-called Camp David Accords in 1978. One thing that helped were both these men, the two leaders, were grandfathers. So the first thing they did was show grandchildren pictures to each other. I've got more pictures than you do, and they kind of hit it off. And of course, Jimmy's there. There they are, all these big smiles. Um, but the three main parts of the Camp David Accords, it did have a certain partial success, but obviously didn't really ultimately do what it hoped to do. One was that Egypt would recognize Israel's right to exist and establish diplomatic relations, which they still have, although it's pretty tenuous. Two, Israel would pull out of the Sinai, which a lot of Israelis, of course, didn't want to do. And then three, the part that's never happened, was Israel had to make some sort of vague promise about Palestinian self-government or autonomy or something. It was very deliberately, phrased very vaguely. And ever since, of course, Israel has always said, we never said a Palestinian state, but the Arab world said, well, you certainly implied that. It did say some things about having a strong police force, but not an army, but having local elections and all that stuff. But it was viewed by most, not just Palestinians, but most Arabs as a sellout. It did mean that Israel was more secure in terms of this, by far the most populous Arab country is now technically at peace with them, with Egypt. Some ways it led to the death of Sadat, though. Yeah, this is sort of the agreements, the signing of it. But in 1981, a few years later, Sadat was assassinated, which probably most of you remember, by people in his own army. It was at a military review, but these guys jumped out of the back of a truck. They were members of an extremist Islamist group. I think they actually call themselves Islamic Jihad, and killed Sadat in 1981. Although I read later that that wasn't the only reason they hated him, not just because he sold out the Palestinian cause and the Muslim cause. Sadat's wife was very strong in pushing for women's rights and emancipation in Egypt, and they really hated him just as much for that. But we feel focus on the geopolitical thing. But in any case, Sadat is murdered. You just get another member of that group, though, that comes in, of course, Mubarak, who then rules until 2011, till the Arab Spring. This is a parody of the most famous picture of Theodor Herzl at that photo I showed you before at the Zionist Congress in 1897. Of course, now it's Yasser Arafat. Because, there's such an irony that the Palestinians are now in very much the situation the Jews had been. There's now a Palestinian diaspora. There are Palestinians who are certainly accused of being terrorists, just like the British accused some of the Zionist groups and so on. They have been dispossessed. And eventually in 1988 is when Arafat first, he looks kind of coy there, said that he kind of hinted that he would recognize the right of Israel to exist, because before the PLO just was adamant, we can't even, accept that they're a country. The Zionist entity is what they tend to call it. But then you had the Oslo Accords running through here, 93, 94, Arafat there, and of course, Bill Clinton, and then Yitzhak Rabin, a man who was in the Labor Party, but had been a great Israeli war hero. He's maybe the best general Israel had. And so again, I think he had an even harder time, I think, shaking Arafat's hand. Arafat was smiling. I think the Arabs have more of that sense. You're hospitable to people if you hate them, if you're supposed to be hospitable. But you could just tell that Yitzhak Rabin had a really hard time. But they shook hands in front of the White House, and the Oslo Accords were the ones that said they'll create a Palestinian authority, but there would be a Palestinian state of some sort, using parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But they would have elections, which they finally had for a Palestinian authority, and so on. But it didn't reach, full peace, obviously. It's partly because of people who didn't want peace. It's so much easier to disrupt peace than to negotiate peace. And there were people on both sides. You had, by the mid-90s, you had this group called Hamas, which I might have a picture. Let's see. Yeah, there's their symbol, which you can see is all about religion. Hamas starts in 1987. It's an acronym that means the Islamic Resistance Movement. It is an explicitly Islamist resistance group as opposed to the PLO. And they still have not recognized Israel's right to exist. That map up there, of course, is all green, which is the Muslim color, is all of Israel, and the West Bank and Gaza, the Dome of the Rock, and so on. That's the symbol of their military wing, which again, the Quran, the Dome of the Rock, so on. There's a group in the PLO now that's tried to sort of answer all that by also stressing religion more. They're the ones who did a lot of the suicide bombings in y'all's lifetime, our lifetime. But going, that's the Hamas flag. But Hamas, literally, it's an acronym, but the word itself means zeal in Arabic, so it works out wonderfully. Just like MAD for the mutual assured destruction, the nuclear deterrent doctrine. But they started doing the suicide bombings. They don't want the Oslo Accords to obviously go through. They said we shouldn't have any Israel at all. But there were also increasingly, which is so worrisome, these Zionists zealots, these extremists, violent people. For example, two things that happened about this. Yeah, the men of the year for 94, I guess, or 93 maybe, were Rabin and Arafat, but then also Nelson Mandela and de Klerk, the South African leader. The South African situation hasn't worked out perfectly, but it certainly seemed to have been resolved more than the Arab-Israeli question has been resolved. But this was when an American extremist Zionist doctor, Baruch Goldstein from New York, went and murdered about 29 Arab Palestinian worshipers at the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. He just went in and shot them. What Israel had worked out was there was a certain time of the day when Jews can go and worship there and acknowledge the patriarchs, but then other times when the Muslims are there. This guy went in there and just murdered a bunch of people. And also, Itzhak Rabin, y'all remember, in 95 was assassinated by an Israeli extremist, who was almost certainly in part inspired by Netanyahu, because the Likud and people even further right, they put up pictures like with Rabin in a Nazi uniform. If you do that in Israel, you're basically begging someone to kill this guy. And what that picture is, Rabin was at a sort of peace rally, and they sang some song about peace in I think it was in Jerusalem. And then this man in his mid-20s, Yigal Amir is his name, just went up and shot him. And of course, the blood stains there on this song about peace. And I think, and there he is. He's still unrepentant. He's in prison, but he still says, I did the right thing, because he said Rabin was betraying the people of Israel. He's betraying the Eretz Israel. And he just reflects something that's become stronger and stronger in Israel. That's what I've been reading about the last week or two, is these religious Zionists who are so much more adamant. I mean, obviously any Israeli gets furious when you say this is basically a Zionist Nazi, but some of them are, they're basically Zionist Nazis. I mean, they say that Arabs should be killed if we have to. They should be completely driven out of these territories. They celebrate when they set fire to homes of Arab Palestinian families where like a little baby died, and they celebrate. This guy has memorials to him in some of these settlement camps in the West Bank, the man who assassinated Rabin. And also Goldstein is the man who went in and shot all these people who were just worshiping the tomb patriarch. So it's, the more you study this, obviously, just the more depressing it gets. But I think if Rabin had managed to live, and again, with his background, there might have been a creation of a Palestinian state, which might have finally began to solve this problem. But his murder, and then the next year is when Netanyahu first came to power in 96, because the bombs are going off, Hamas is doing all this suicide bombing. Just most Israelis kind of felt like, the hardliners are right. There's no talking to Arabs, that we just have to be hardline. And okay. So, yeah, there's Arafat. This is what, of course, Palestinians talk about, that the settlements have just increased over the years. And they started having those settlements in the West Bank, even under the Labor Party, but under Likud, once Menachem Begin came in, and certainly under someone like Netanyahu, they, just blatantly have grabbed areas in the West Bank so that the possibility of really having a viable Palestinian state is just more and more remote. And like I said, the most hardline people tend to be in these settlements. And, I wish I could hold out some kind of little mild optimism here about all this, but right now I don't see, Netanyahu, I don't think is going to last much longer, but there are people in his cabinet now who have been, outspoken in all these things I'm talking about. That seems to be almost like a Zionist type of Nazism. And they used to be considered such a fringe in Israel, but they're not anymore. And a lot of it has to do with birth rates. A lot of it has to do with just Israelis finally, becoming more hardline for a lot of different reasons. But fiction fact. And of course, one other thing that you all know about, they've built this wall, which in some ways seemed to be really effective until last October, about cutting down on the number of suicide bombings, all this, the intifada, which means the shaking off in Arabic. There's been more than one intifada in recent years of them trying to cause enough disturbances to make Israel change. But they built this wall that kind of, serpentine goes through the West Bank. In some places, it's like 26 feet tall, but that's the wall that the Hamas people broke through in October, and surprised everyone, because Israel generally very conscious of their security. But I need to stop here so people can ask questions. I hope, maybe. Do we have time for?
One of the things that giving intended when the Israelis went in to rescue the folks in 1970s, only one person from that range was killed, and it happened to be Netanyahu. Who was the golden boy of the family. Yes. No,
Yeah, you could do a whole series of the lectures about Netanyahu in the story because, he's been prime minister now longer than anyone ever has, including David Ben-Gurion. But yes, his brother was the one Israeli commando in that amazing, again, miraculous, sort of rescue that was done mainly. That, of course, the people that took the hostages were like German Marxists. They weren't Palestinians. Well, at least some of them weren't. But no, I think, Netanyahu is not the ultimate problem. It's the fact that so many people do agree with him. In fact, he's viewed by some of these really hardline religious settlers as being too moderate, you know. And it really has changed because even, Begin and the Irgun, they were not religious Orthodox Zionists. But the ones now that really are so adamant that, they were furious when Ariel Sharon was also a hardliner in his own way, but when he gave back the Gaza Strip in 2005 and said we can't have thousands of troops there to protect just a small number of settlers among these 2 million Arabs. But some of the settler movement, they were fierce. Of course, now I guess they would say, see what happened, you let them have a little bit of self-government. And by the way Hamas came to power is in 2006, they had elections for the Palestinian Authority. And we, of course, hoped that the PLO would win, Fatah would win, because they were the ones who recognized Israel's right to exist. But Hamas actually won the vote. And they took over in Gaza, but the PLO and Al-Fatah did not let them take over in the West Bank. So now you had two different Palestinian authorities. Netanyahu has openly said, I want that to be true. It splits their opposition to us. So he has actually encouraged the growth of Hamas in some ways. He let the Gulf states give money to Hamas to kind of make that viable. So this whole idea about, divide and rule, but then sort of backfired on him, to put it mildly. But yes, his brother, if I still remember, there were two made-for-TV specials after that 1976 thing. One was called Rescue at Entebbe. One was called Victory at Entebbe. It was clearly, the American media then was like, Israel's the good guy. And Richard Dreyfuss played Netanyahu's brother. I can't remember his first name. Jonathan, okay, yes. Played the role really well. But back then, it was like America was almost unanimous, I think, in saying, except unless you were Palestinian American, that they were the good guys in the story.
Yes, one thing that I've found striking is that the ultra-right Orthodox religious part of Israelis community contributes less than the more secular part, both in terms of the fact they don't serve in the military, they pay less taxes. And I find that amazing that the more secular part of Israeli society is willing to put up with that.
He was saying that as much as the hyper ultra Orthodox, the Haredim, that so many of the males spend their entire adult life in shul, in the yeshiva, studying the Torah and the Talmud. They're largely have been exempt from military service, and everyone else, including women, have had to serve. And yes, the more secular, non-observant Jews in Israel hate that because it's like, we're protecting you. You're adamant about not making any kind of peace, but then you're not fighting, and you're not adding to the the wealth of our country, by just. And there have been some concessions. There is now a regiment in the Israeli army that's made up of ultra-Orthodox who are, trying to serve, but most of them still don't. And so again, this is their, I'm an outsider looking in, but yeah, you could see why they would not be happy about this, the secular Israelis.
Apartheidism. You mentioned that Palestinians could vote and certain things like that.
Well, that you do have essentially, even in Gaza and the West Bank, there's supposedly self-government, but the Israelis obviously kind of reserve the right to go in, as they have done now, and they've had in the West Bank over and over again. And just the way what the South African apartheid government tried to do eventually in the 60s would have these Bantu stands, when they called the black South Africans the Bantu. And that there were several, like Sun City was one of them in these areas, and they were scattered across South Africa. Oops. But they were certainly not viable states, and almost no one recognized them as being independent. South Africa did, of course, a couple other countries did. But the best land was all kept, for the white-controlled part of South Africa. So it was just a farce. It was a sham. And once Mandela came to power, of course, they immediately swept them away, these Bantu stands. But in some ways, it looks like the what's left of what would be a Palestinian state almost resemble that. But it's also the idea of, which infuriates Israelis, that they are a colonial, a settler colony, that they are a product of Western imperialism. And there is obviously a huge grain of truth to that. I also think it's not quite the same as, like Algerian French colons settling there in the 19th century as opposed to Jews coming back to their homeland, but again, that's something where the emotions just run so high. But I think the reason why the generational gap has occurred is the worst thing now you can call someone American popular culture is either a racist or an imperialist. And Israel now is tagged with both those lines. And to so many people in the United States, white and Black Americans, now particularly younger ones, the Israelis are the non-people of color, and that they're the oppressors, they're the settlers, and the Palestinians are the people of color, and that's a relatively recent phenomenon, but yeah.
Okay, I think that he will be here for questions afterward, not forever, but for a few minutes. You guys, I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone. Please feel free to come up. I want to thank Art very much for his time. We know that the small acknowledgement we make from a financial standpoint doesn't have anything to do with the time that you spend and the care that you give to this congregation. And we very much appreciate your helping us contextualize what is going on. If we could bow our heads. Loving God, today is Palm Sunday. We celebrate, we acknowledge Jesus's riding into Jerusalem. We've been hearing about Jerusalem. We've been hearing about what is happening in your name and outside of your name. This is a holy week, God. We have a very difficult memorial on Wednesday that hits our Nashville community hard. Then we have the Last Supper on Thursday. We have Good Friday. And then God, you send the greatest gift next Sunday of sacrifice and love. God, thank you for walking with us in the suffering and for your constant reminder that your love is there and our job is to represent it in every opportunity that we have. In your name we pray. Amen.